It used to be that everyone put themselves into a box. But it wasn't a bad box, not a prison cell. It was something everyone was gladly part of. These boxes were called subcultures. If you look back through this nation's history, there are virtually countless subcultures that had varying impacts on the country as a whole. Gone are the days of the stoners and the jocks. No more are there hard separations between gothic kids and the heavy metal Hessians. If you, like me, grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, subcultures were a big part of your upbringing, and you probably belonged to a specific group when you were in school. Where did these subcultures and their associated camaraderie go? And what's so different for younger generations that broke down these walls? This video will explore the factors that created the American subculture and some of the most impactful subcultures there were. Then, we'll explain why subculture has evolved from a micro scale to a macro, effectively killing the long-lived phenomenon. As someone born in 1980, I consider myself part of the Xennial generation. Through this channel, I aim to explore the world from the unique perspective that we possess. My videos showcase my philosophical understanding of the subject, supplemented with verifiable facts and information to support my beliefs. If you disagree, I welcome your thoughts and opinions in the comments section. As always, there are chapters in the description that will let you skip to any section you want. If you're new here at the Xennial Philosopher, thanks for checking out some of my content. I hope you'll return soon to continue expanding your perception and growing your mind alongside me. If you grew up pre-2000, you were probably heavily influenced by whatever subculture you identified with. For most of the 20th century, and probably before that, when a person reached adolescence, they usually picked a subculture they felt they most belonged to. If you, like me, were born in the early 80s and attended high school in the 90s, then you will clearly remember the demarcations assigned to virtually everyone. The actual names for the various groups were different depending on where you grew up, but for the most part, there were the hippies or stoners, the metalheads or Hessians, the goths or emo kids, the punks, the jocks, and probably a few others. Regardless of your group, you probably accepted and adopted their system of beliefs and morals to guide you through becoming an adult. At the same time as feeling one with a larger group of like-minded people, these subgroups let us have a defined us and a designated them. Us being anyone within our group or possibly an adjacent group, and the them being easily defined as anyone belonging to any group other than yours. Let's quickly look at the official history of subcultures, according to the internet. To begin with, subcultures are not an exclusively American experience by any means, and in fact, it looks like the first rumblings of these subdivisions of society were reported in London before World War I. In pre-war London, some small groups began loosely organizing with like-minded people. And out of these early subcultures, we got diverse talents from the likes of Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forrester. World War I brought the us and them of subcultures to the States by judging men on the length of their hair. Soldiers who served in the war spent a lot of time in dirty trenches on battlefields, and as a result of the filth, men in the military had to shave their heads to avoid the lice. A stark line was drawn when they came home, and the men who maintained their longer hairstyles were quickly labeled as pacifists, deserters, and the like. Maybe there's a link between the hippies and this early social division. After this, the subdivisions of culture accelerated with further splintering. In the 1920s, jazz and the newfangled car created subcultures in the form of flappers and swing kids, and later in the decade, Prohibition created a subversive subculture of drinkers and smugglers. The 1930s and 40s saw art movements like Surrealism and political movements like the Nazis, while gangster culture grew in popularity in the US. At the tail end of the 1940s, Jack Kerouac made a cross-country motorcycle trip that helped birth the beatnik movement in the 1950s. In Europe during the 50s, existentialism was a growing cultural subdivision, and it had a heavy influence on the beatniks. In addition to the long-haired intellectual precursors to the hippies, the 1950s saw the rise in gang culture in urban areas, the invention of rock and roll, and even the early rise of the surfing subculture. The 1960s were perhaps the golden age of subcultures. As the beatnik culture spread, it fractured into several influential subcultures that defined the decade. The radicals, bikers, mods, hippies, and freaks can all be tied back to their beatnik roots. The 60s and 70s saw large groups of young people joining counterculture groups that terrified the Christians and Republicans that are always quick to criticize. The proliferation of new ideas, new music, and of course LSD created one of the most influential subcultures. As the 1970s matured, the hippie movement had grown so large it was hard to classify it as a subculture. Their aesthetic and more palatable ideas were fully adopted by mainstream culture by the end of that decade. The 1970s saw a significant rise in other subcultures that persisted beyond the end of the century. Groups like anarchists, punks, disco and country music cultures, and even geeks proudly enjoyed their own subculture. Despite the seeming growth of the phenomenon of subcultures, the explosion in individualism that the 60s and 70s sparked off was probably also the death knell for subculture as a whole. Before I can get into the 80s, 90s, and beyond, I'll have to shift gears into what killed subcultures, as a lot of what happened while I was growing up is really what killed the whole phenomenon. What killed subculture? As we established in the previous section, subcultures had a nice run from their initial rumblings at the dawn of the 20th century through the late 70s. For these first 70 years or so of subculture as we know it, those that subscribed to their chosen subculture were subversive. They went against what society wanted and upset the status quo, and the mainstream railed against them, calling them nasty names and creating drug wars and culture wars to keep them from messing with their plans. But at the end of the 70s, and particularly in the 1980s and 90s, Western culture saw a paradigm shift that changed subcultures forever, eventually breaking them. The problem was that the powers that be, or in other words, those with the most money, power, and influence, realized that they could use these subcultures for their own ends. This began with the late 70s wide acceptance of hippie aesthetics, effectively taking the teeth out of the movement and letting squares wear bell-bottoms and grow their hair long without general ridicule from their peers. With this success, marketers embraced many subcultures to grow brands and sell products. An excellent and common example would be the Harley-Davidson motorcycle brand, which has enraptured biker culture with its products. Or how about Ford? They sell more Ford F-150 trucks than any other vehicle in the US. A large part of that is their co-opting of the cowboy and country music cultures. There are countless other examples of what was once a legitimate subculture, like gangster rap or deadheads, that has been completely and totally co-opted by corporations cashing in on the people that identify or want to identify with the subculture they exploit. The subcultures gutted by corporate greed are countless. But we saw the butchering happen in the 1990s. Any budding subculture that even peeked its tiny head above the water was immediately and ruthlessly snatched up by the powerful and mined for cash. One stark example is the early 1990s grunge movement. Grunge was initially more or less an ideal example of a real subculture that grew up out of a single region facing hard times. I think the people who first started playing grunge were specifically doing it as a screw you to the corporations already farming subculture for gold. Within months of the emergence of a semi-formed subculture, the vultures descended en masse to bring it to the world in the form of radio play, t-shirts, and entire stores filled with flannel shirts and blue jeans. The desperate desire to capitalize on the grunge subculture basically killed it in its infancy. Since then, no other budding or emerging subculture in the Western world has been allowed to grow without massive corporate investment. This kind of culture mining can be found in how some of these other once promising subcultures were turned into bland, corporately acceptable imitations of what they could have been. For example, goths and emos, or the entire rap and hip-hop subculture, or how the Grateful Dead has turned into a money-milking tribute band, or 1,000 other examples of how the comfort and acceptance that so many long for in subculture of like-minded people has been poisoned and more or less destroyed. What about current subcultures? Conclusion. As we wrap this video up, I want you to remember that as someone born in 1980, I consider myself part of the Xennial generation, and through this channel, I aim to explore the world from the unique perspectives that we possess. My videos showcase my understanding of the subject, supplemented with verifiable facts and information to support my beliefs. If you disagree, I welcome your thoughts and opinions in the comment section. I don't doubt that many of you think I must be crazy because our culture seems to be ruled by subcultures these days. But by asking that question, you are proving my point. Subculture used to be something someone embraced because they didn't fit in with the status quo of people. Now, everyone spends a couple of years in their early teenage years reading about all the possible subcultures you might join. Then, when someone picks one, they enter the proper forums or subreddits and order the appropriate clothes from the internet. That isn't subculture. Do you think once a culture is wholly made up of large, homogeneous subcultures, it means that there's more or less overall culture? I argue that the ease of finding anything on the internet, coupled with the over-corporatization of anything that might resemble a subculture that can be exploited, have made the authentic experiences that we had unobtainium. Gone are the days when someone could be part of a genuinely subversive subcultural group. Instead, we have pseudo-groups of people who ostensibly share similar values or interests. Still, in reality, it's just a giant game of shells where inside each unique subculture, these days are just a bunch of corporate shills and confused people looking for something tangible to be part of. Sadly, as they existed in the last century, subcultures will likely never be the same again. At least until we go through a world-ending apocalypse and the survivors rebuild civilization back up to about 1900s level. But that doesn't mean we won't come up with something new or better. I don't know. Maybe what the younger generations come up with to subvert the system will be unique and novel. Or perhaps it's already happening right under our noses. Or Maybe it will take another sea change in society before we see another phenomenon like that. It might just have been the right time for it when it happened. Regardless, as I usually say at this point, don't let this subject matter get you down. I'm here to get you thinking philosophically about the bigger picture that society is painting, because without stepping back and looking at the whole picture, we can only watch it crumble around us. If we open our minds and eyes, there's a damn good chance we'll come out of this strange time perfectly fine. What did you think about these concepts? Do you plan to learn more from the resources below? Did you hear something you'd like me to do a full video on? Let me know in the comments if your interest has been piqued by any of the subjects covered here at the Xennial Philosopher. Check out references and links to related videos and articles in the description to learn more about this video's topics. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget so you won't miss out on new videos to expand your mind and grow your perception.